ChatGPT keeps giving you answers that sound polished but feel average, then this is not an accident. Because left unstructured, ChatGPT is a people pleaser. It is programmed to be agreeable, to smooth things over, and to be helpful. But in a professional context, that often translates to vague and generic and average output. Now, if you're using it for a quick search or light ghostwriting like email drafting, that's perfectly fine. But if you're doing it or doing some kind of work that requires rigor, like stress test a high stakes decision, interrogate your own reasoning, or use AI as a co-thinking partner rather than a replacement for your thought, then generic AI will fail you. If your goal is not just convenience but cognitive quality, you need to move from being a user to being an architect. I'm Dr. Denise Marti. I'm a professor of human AI interaction, and today we're going to discuss the architecture of customized GPTs, who needs them, why they matter, and the best practices for building them thoughtfully. First of all, this is not going to be a simple technical tutorial about where to click, how to click through the GPT builder. We're going to talk more conceptually about how to think clearly about customized GPTs, what they are, why they matter, and where people get them wrong, and how to design them with intellectual purpose. The goal of a customized GPT is not to save 5 minutes in your workday. It is to elevate the quality of the work you do in those 5 minutes. If you want to jump into my protocol for creating a customized GPT, you can jump into part 3, but I highly recommend listening to the first part because we're going to talk about why to customize GPT at all. Let's start with that. Why would anyone build a customized GPT? Generalized systems tend to produce general outputs. Generic AI is broad, it is flexible, but it's often vulnerable to what I would call the contextual drift. It tries to be useful across too many situations for too many people under too many assumptions, and that often leads to an average answer. A customized GPT becomes valuable when you want the same kind of work done repeatedly with the same standards, with the same boundaries, with the same tone or same reference base. Instead of re-explaining the task every time, you define the structure once, and I believe in a world of generic information, this specificity becomes the new currency. We don't customize only to save time. We customize to preserve the integrity of our expertise. If you're a business professional, for example, trying to think through a strategic decision, you don't need the AI to simply sound helpful. You need it to surface trade-offs, challenge your assumptions, and stay aligned with the logic of the problem. Or if you're a lawyer, the issue is not whether to give an answer which is fluent. The issue is whether the reasoning is disciplined, bounded, and anchored to the right materials. Another example, if you're a content creator, you may notice a different failure mode. Sameness, I call it. Generic models tend to flatten the voice, flatten originality, authenticity, and push ideas towards the center. So instead of amplifying your thinking, they dilute your thinking. If you're a specialist of any kind, researcher, analyst, consultant, engineer, designer, the problem is usually the same. The model gives you an answer that is competent enough to sound useful, but not specific enough to trust. And even professional gamers can benefit from thinking about this carefully, because if performance depends on pattern recognition, decision speed, situational review, opponent analysis, and disciplined reflection, then generic AI will often lose. What you need is a system that thinks with a structure for your game, for your role, for your review process, for your profession. So what a customized GPT actually is. A common mistake is to think a customized GPT as a personalized chatbot. It is true, but it is not necessarily. A custom GPT is better understood as a designed cognitive system. It reflects your choices about your purpose for the task or for the discipline and the scope, the context. your reasoning model, and constraints, the knowledge that needs to be ingested, and the tools, the trade-offs, and the failure modes, the edge cases, and we're going to talk about in the protocol. The meaningful question is not how do I make a bot, but more what kind of cognitive behavior am I designing? Now I want to also answer who should use a customized GPT. Not everyone, as I mentioned, needs one. A customized GPT becomes useful, I call it, when three conditions are true. If the task is recurring, consistency matters, right? And the user wants a particular way of thinking, not just a generic assistance. If that's the case, then customized GPT is going to be good for you. That could apply to many groups, as I mentioned, content creators, gamers, lawyers, doctors, students, professors, researchers, analysts, any business professionals. And also leaders, entrepreneurs may use one for decision support and trade-off analysis and strategic reflections. Let's talk a little bit about why generic ChatGPT often falls short. Generic ChatGPT tends to suffer from three design limitations when the task is specialized. What I call, the first one is the contextual drift. As conversations grow, earlier intent can become less central. The conversation evolves and the model tries to remain helpful, but your original constraints may not stay fully salient. So a customized GPT reduces the problem because the role and rules are fixed at the system level. Second one is the weak grounding. Generic use often depends on broad prior knowledge, plus whatever you paste into the chat. That is not always enough for high integrity work. If you paste into long documents, the model may miss nuance and flatten distinctions or fail to maintain a stable framework. A customized GPT allows you to ground the system in curated materials. The third one is the default helpfulness. As I mentioned, generic systems are optimized to be broadly helpful and pleasant. That often produces overly smooth, overly agreeable, and sometimes too generic output. A customized GPT allows you to build what I call a negative constraint framework. You can explicitly say, do not guess, do not invent citations, do not moralize, do not use vague corporate language, do not overstate confidence, do not provide generic filler. That is not cosmetic touches. These are actually real behavioral designs that you're going to implement. Now, let me show you the interface. Firstly, I want to be clear on this. This is something that I tell my students all the time. If your thinking is vague, your GPT, your prompts, your interactions with AI will be vague. Good design for anything in life starts with clear, crystal clear thinking. So once you're in ChatGPT, you go to the ChatGPT's area and select Create, and OpenAI lets you build a GPT conversationally or configure directly into the edition. So for this, I recommend going straight to the configure because it gives you the maximum control over instructions, knowledge, capabilities, and testing. So let's look at the Create. This is guided conversational builder. It helps you sketch the GPT by chatting your way into the draft. It is useful for a quick setup, but is not where the deepest design work happens. Let's look at the configure. This is the direct editor. This is where you specify your system deliberately. If you care about precision, constraints, and architecture, this is a better place to work. Let's start with name. This is simply the GPT's functional identity. Keep it clear, task specific. The name should communicate what the system is for. That's simple. The editor itself includes the naming fields as a part of GPT setup. Description. This is the short explanation of what the GPT does. Think of it as one paragraph positioning statement for the tool. OpenAI includes description as part of GPT configuration flow. Let's now talk about the instructions. This is the most important part. Instructions define the GPT's behavior, tone, rules, goals, boundaries. This is where you decide how it should reason, what it should prioritize, and what it should avoid. We're going to talk all about those in the protocol. And conversation starters, these are example prompts. They're not decoration per se, they're more like intended workflow and teach the user how this GPT is supposed to be used. And knowledge. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about knowledge here. This is the GPT's reference base. These are uploaded files to GPT that it can use when answering questions. Knowledge is not the same as instructions. Instructions shape behavior, and you can think of that as knowledge supplies grounded source material. A common question that I want to clarify here is that if AI can already has access so much information, pretty much all the internet, then why do I need the knowledge ingestion at all? Good question, very good question, because broad access to information is not the same as grounded, relevant, stable reference. The internet is large, uneven, noisy, messy, and often misaligned with the exact task you care about. Sometimes you don't want the model relying on whatever is out there. You want it to anchor to your own materials, your syllabus, your framework, your material, your code book, your policy, your lab vocabulary, whatever that is, right? Your internal documents. So the distinction is simple. Web access gives reach, but knowledge ingestion gives grounding. Knowledge ingestion matters for 3 reasons. First of all, it reduces drift toward generic answers, and instead of defaulting the average internet language, the GPT can stay closer to your material. And knowledge in GPT is specifically designed for uploaded files that GPT can reference when answering questions. The second reason is that it supports consistency across repeated use. If you want the GPT to keep using the same rubric, the glossary, the internal logic over time, uploaded knowledge is much more stable than hoping model reconstructs the framework from the general content out there. The third reason is that it gives you bounded authority. OpenAI's knowledge feature is meant for additional context from your files, and OpenAI notes that text-heavy, well-structured documents work better than messy, highly visual ones. Since we covered the knowledge, now we can move on to capabilities. These are extra tools or features that GPT can use, such as web search or image generation. And the apps or actions are the ones that GPT needs to connect to outside tools or APIs. That usually happens here. Now let me tell you the GPT design protocol. Again, I always tell my students, be crystal clear in your thinking. Vague design comes from vague thinking. Before you build a customized GPT, you do not begin with just the interface. You begin with your crystal clear, beautiful brain. A good GPT starts with the disciplined thinking about what the system is for, how it should reason, what it should prioritize, and where it should fail safely. So here's the protocol. Step 1. Define the recurring task. Okay, what is the repeated kind of work that this GPT is meant to support? It is not help me with the work, be smart, support my business, not those kind of vague, generic tasks. Better if you phrase it as help me stress test strategic business decisions. Help my students deepen understanding of difficult concepts. Help lawyers review arguments for structure ambiguity. Help content creators refine scripts without flattening the voice. So on and so forth. So these are good, specific tasks. But if you cannot define the recurring task clearly, the GPT will likely to be vague. So I recommend you spend enough time in defining and being very specific in this step. Second step is define the reasoning behavior. This is one of the most important steps. Do not just ask what the GPT should talk about. It's going to talk about a lot of things, but instead be clear on how it should think. Should it critique? Should it compare? Should it classify? Should it synthesize? Should it provide counter arguments, generate alternatives, generate counter alternatives? Should it ask diagnostic questions, separate evidence from interpretation, explicitly acknowledge uncertainty. A GPT improves dramatically when you define not just the topic or the content itself, but the reasoning behavior. A weak GPT just relies on the topic, but a strong GPT has a reasoning model, how it knows how it's going to behave. Number 3, the third step in the protocol is define what it should prioritize. Every GPT faces trade-offs, of course, like in life. So ask, what should this GPT privilege when tensions appear? For example, let's say accuracy over speed, or nuance over confidence, or structure over creativity, evidence over polish. These are some examples of the trade-offs that you may be considering. Or clarity over comprehensiveness. If you do not define priorities, then the GPT will often default to smoothness and general helpfulness. That may sound good, that is, why not, right? But it is often not what serious, rigorous work requires. So make sure that you know your trade-offs. Number 4, step 4, define what it should avoid. This is where many people under-design. Good GPT design is not just about what the system should do, it is also what it must not do. Good negative guidance includes do not guess, do not invent citations, do not overstate certainty, do not sound overconfident, do not assume intent, do not moralize, do not fill the gaps with generic knowledge. So without it, your GPT often reverts to vague, eager to please behavior. Step 5, define how it should handle ambiguity. A well-designed GPT should know when to slow down. It should know when to say, I'm not sure, I'm not confident, this is one plausible interpretation, or I need more evidence, I need more context. Here's what I can infer, and here's what I cannot infer. Here's what it remains uncertain. Without this, the system may sound smoother than the evidence warrants, but this is one of the most dangerous failure modes in AI. Not obvious nonsense, but the polished overconfidence. I emphasize this a lot in my teaching. Step 6, decide what sources it should rely on. So now move to grounding, okay? Ask, when should GPT stay tightly anchored to the uploaded files, the knowledge that you ask it to ingest, right? When should it answer more generally? How much interpretive freedom should it have? This is where the instructions and knowledge meet. A GPT should not always improvise broadly. Sometimes it should remain tightly grounded in your documents, your internal documents, your framework, your code book, your rubric, and your value system. So this step is about deciding what the source hierarchy is. This is very important. Step 7, define how success will be evaluated. This is what turns instructions into architecture. Ask, what does a good output look like? What does a bad output look like also? And what failure modes am I trying to reduce or minimize? For example, if you don't want the answer, the output to be too vague, too confident, too generic, or too agreeable, too confident, overly confident, too verbose, you can specify that. If you cannot define what a success and failure means in any design, this comes from an engineering professor, then you need to be clear about what a success means, what a failure means in your design. You will not be able to refine the system well. You won't be able to iterate it well. Step 8, define the user and the stakes. Who is this ChatGPT for? What is at stake when it performs poorly? A GPT for a doctor, you can say a lawyer, a professor, a student, a business professional. It could be just like a generic public use, or a business leader, or professional gamer, as I mentioned. There's so many different stakeholders that your GPT can be useful for, but it's important to understand who the target audience is. It could be just you, could be exactly like you, but then define in which lens am I the user for? Am I the user as an analyst, as a professional, as a productivity optimizer? You can define the target audience in a specific way. Step 9, write the one sentence purpose. Force yourself to write one sentence. This ChatGPT, customized GPT exists to help blank specific user do blank specific task by blank specific kind of reasoning or support. For example, you can say this GPT exists to help business professionals stress test strategic decisions by surfacing trade-offs, assumptions, and hidden risks. This GPT exists to help content creators refine scripts while preserving their authenticity and originality and their voice. If you cannot write this sentence clearly, that means that you need to do a little more work to crystal clear your thinking. The GPT is probably still very vague for you. Step 10, choose the right knowledge to ingest. Okay, now ask what materials should this GPT be anchored to? Not everything, it can't be everything, there's a limit. Only what is relevant and authoritative. So this may include research papers, style guides, internal documents, some like specific vocabulary and policy documents, or if you're a professor or teacher, could be rubrics and some frameworks or some materials that are very specific and includes technical jargon. And any internal documentation. Could be also annotated examples. Knowledge ingestion is not about how much you can upload, it's not about quantity. It's about what information is relevant for you and which one is the authority, grounding source for you. Step 11, design the output structure. A lot of people miss this part because there's a generic output structure that ChatGPT usually gives, and a lot of people are happy about that, but be clear about what you want your GPT to produce. Ask, what should a strong answer look like? Do not leave the output shape vague. For example, a decision support GPT might always respond with decision to be made, options, assumptions, trade-offs, and uncertainties, and possible biases, and possible implicit and explicit assumptions, and also maybe the next steps for the decision maker. Step 12, test edge cases deliberately. In the engineering world, this is crucial. I teach my students all the time. You need to test the edge cases in your design, but you don't need to be an engineer for designing a customized GPT, but do not test only ideal prompts, test also vague prompts, incomplete prompts, conflicting prompts, emotionally loaded prompts, or out of scope prompts that tempt GPT to overreach. A serious GPT should not only perform well under ideal conditions, but it should also fail gracefully at the edges. That is exactly where the design quality reveals itself. Step 13, iterate and tighten. Finally, revise the instructions, improve the constraints, and clean the knowledge files. Because probably at first you're going to brain dump everything, or maybe you need to update the knowledge files later on. So refine the output structure, test, retest, test, retest. A good custom GPT is not just written once, but it is designed, tested, diagnosed, and improved. So to recap, building a customized GPT is not just about technical convenience. I believe that it's more about creating a structured environment for your work, for your thinking, that protects your cognitive resources and forces a higher level intellectual rigor. By moving away from an agreeable nature of generic AI, which I'm sure a lot of you already get bored a little bit, you're essentially training your own ability to discern, to audit, and think critically. Well, as always, thank you for your interest in science and future of human AI interaction. I'm Dr. Denise Marti. I'll see you in the next deep dive. See you in the next video.